Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright. We're going to take a look at the key thesis to the entire Paul project, which is the righteousness of God. And I'm going to give you 4 focus points before we get into the chart. And first, in these pages, Professor Wright tells us that for Paul, the righteousness of God is equal to the faithfulness of God in putting creation right. The righteousness of God equals the faithfulness of God in putting creation right. And the showing forth of this faithfulness is the cross and the resurrection of Christ. It is empowered and it is mediated by the hupakoe, obedience of Jesus the Messiah, and obedience as an attentive perception and submission to God's plan of salvation. And then the 4th point, therefore, for Paul, the Torah has moved forward to God's intended purpose. It has moved forward toward its always intended purpose of fulfillment in the Messiah. But the key thesis for the entire Paul project is that the righteousness of God is equated with the faithfulness of God in putting all of creation right. That is the righteousness of God. The Creator God is faithful in redeeming His creation. That is His faithfulness, and that is God's righteousness. So let's get into our chart. We're going to look at the triad on the left. We'll begin with block 1. We're going to take a look at the content of righteousness as faithfulness. There's a 3-part relational meaning of faithfulness. It is the Greek concept of a dikaiosune theou, for the righteousness of God is a dikaiosune theou, but that refers to God's own righteousness, especially His covenant faithfulness. So it is equated with covenant faithfulness, a faithfulness to bless the nations through Israel. Now there's also a genitive subjective meaning of faithfulness, the pisteios Christou. It's the faith of Christ, referring to God's faithful act through the action of Christ. The cross of Christ abbreviates the category of God's faithfulness to the covenant. There's a servant-like obedience meaning of faithfulness also. The divine act takes place through Jesus, who is the true Israelite. God's faithfulness is closely interwoven with Christ's hupakoe obedience. Therefore, there are 4 Christological subconcepts abbreviated under the category of God's covenant faithfulness. And so, note 4, we'll look at those 4 subconcepts for faithfulness. Number 1 is telos. The passion reflects the purpose of God, His plan of salvation, His teleosis. Next is diatheke. The passion also reflects the covenant movement of God's faithfulness. The next is the apolutrosis. The apolutrosis is the passion reflecting outward toward all sinful humanity, thereby fulfilling Israel's failed vocation when they turned inward. And then 4th, hupakoe. The passion reflects the hupakoe obedience of Christ in fulfilling Adam's and Israel's disobedience. It is the obedience of Christ that brings about the rescue and the fulfillment of covenant faithfulness. So that gives us our content, a way to look at the content of righteousness, of truly meaning covenant faithfulness. Now we'll look at the form of this righteousness in block 2. And we have the concrete showing forth of faithfulness. Romans 3:23 to 26 gives us our key focal passage. There is Paul's statement of the universality of sin. The concept of hamartia is introduced for the first time, and it's equated with idolatry and immorality. And then the concept of grace is introduced for the first time, showing that covenant justice is a free gift. The covenant faithfulness of God is a free gift. Christ is the showing forth of God's faithfulness. It is the endai showing forth. Christ in the cross and the resurrection is the endai showing forth of the Father's covenant faithfulness as a sign-like indicator. The cross becomes a signification and a showing forth of the faithfulness of God toward covenant and toward redeeming all of creation. Now, on note 2, the Christological conclusions to be drawn from this showing forth are the fact that everyone is declared right who puts their trust in the faithfulness of Christ, and indeed the Creator God Himself is justified in this act also. The faith of the Messiah reveals the God who is faithful to His covenant Abraham promise. And then note 3, we'll take a look at the eschatological shaping of this form, of this faithfulness. It is an eschatological shape. Christ's hupakoe obedience inaugurates a new Exodus people and a new Exodus kingdom. Romans 3:24 tells us that the concept of apolutrosis for redemption is closely associated with its Septuagint use for the Passover act in Exodus. Therefore, hupakoe obedience and apolutrosis redemption come together in the concept of hilasterion, or the defining of Jesus as the mercy seat of all redemption. The place of redemption is Jesus the Messiah. He is the mercy seat. He's the place of redemption. His blood is the blood that is sprinkled on the mercy seat, so He is the mercy seat. He's the Paschal Lamb. He is the blood of atonement. He is the place of redemption. Jesus the Messiah is the place of redemption for Paul. So we have a content of righteousness for God as faithful to the covenant. We have a form as an eschatology that moves toward redemption, because the place of redemption is Jesus the Messiah. So redemption means to be in the Messiah. So we have our content, we have our form. Now we're going to take a look at Paul's covenant theology in block 3. And we're told there are 6 theological considerations for Paul's theology. God's plan of salvation would always involve Israel, or the true Israelite. 2, all nations are to be rescued from their sinful state. Jesus becomes Israel's representative as the true Israelite. And Jesus is the fulfillment of the covenant Abraham promise. And Paul is drawing a theological picture of God's covenant faithfulness. So Paul's theology is a covenant theology. And the concept of election is being shaped through the filter of covenant theology. Paul redefines the people of God as the new covenant people through his covenant theology. We end up with 3 central axioms for Paul's covenant theology, and they're all in Romans. We have axiom 1, Romans 3:25. God's righteousness is defined as His faithfulness in putting creation right. Axiom 2, Romans 3:27. Boasting that Israel is the way of new Exodus must be negated, because now we have a new law, the law of the faithfulness of God, and that new law reigns supreme. And axiom 3 is in Romans 3:31. New righteousness and new law reach new fulfillment as histe nomen, which means that Christ moves the Torah law forward under the Father's original intended purpose. Christ is the fulfillment of the law because he moves it forward into the full revelation of God's soteriological covenant with all of creation, and God is faithful to fulfill his covenant, and that defines his righteousness. The righteousness of God is equated with the faithfulness of God toward redeeming all of creation. So we have our content, our form, and our fulfillment, and now we will look at the concrete side because we know that Paul always taught a concrete theology. So if you look at the right, we've got block 1, the Torah and soteriology, and Professor Wright takes us to Galatians 2 through 4 and Galatians 2, 19 and 20. We have 4 focal points. First, Paul has died to the law. Paul is crucified with Christ. Christ now lives in Paul, and Paul now lives within the faithfulness of the Son of God. He lives within the faithfulness of the Son as the Messiah. The emphasis is not on faith in Christ. The emphasis is on the faithfulness of Christ. He's testifying here to what has happened not only to himself but to all of Israel. He is relating the meaning of the cross and the resurrection to the new elect people of God, those who were in the Messiah, those who are in the Messiah. So if we look at note 2, Paul's redefined concept of election. Election has been redefined around the Messiah. The elect of Israel belong to those who are in Jesus the Messiah. Galatians 2:15 tells us that the elect are those justified by the faithfulness of Christ, and as the pisteas Christou, which is genitive subjective. It is the faithfulness of Christ, pisteas Christou. God's people are those who are in the Messiah. For Paul, the cross and the resurrection provide the reshaping of election, and Galatians 2:16 should be translated not faith in the Messiah, but the faithfulness of the Messiah. His faithfulness unto becoming a curse, so that we are not accursed, and a faithfulness unto the death of the cross. Therefore, pistai, faithfulness, and ekloge, election, both lead to the kaiao, justification. The faithfulness of Christ and Paul's new understanding of election lead to justification as life in the Messiah, living in the Messiah, and trusting in the faithfulness of Jesus the Messiah, trusting in his faithfulness, his pisteas Christou. Now in block 2, Professor Wright tells us that there are 6 key developments in Paul's covenant theology. Number 1, the Passion is an act of Christ's agape self-giving. Number 2, the Passion was divinely ordained, even far back into Israel's narrative of being a chosen people. 3, death and resurrection become apocalyptic markers for Paul and his doctrine of justification. Paul himself is also caught up in the cross and resurrection, and Paul posits the notion of the indwelling of the Messiah. He has a strong pneumatology. And so 6, through pistis, faith, the believer participates in the cross and the resurrection, and fulfillment can only mean dying to the old self and rising again as the new self. A dying and a rising again. So we get great teaching on basically the thesis for the entire Paul project by N.T. Wright. This is the thesis section of his project. Pages 840 to 860 give us the thesis that, number 1, the righteousness of God is equated with God's faithfulness to covenant faithfulness. The form is eschatological. It is a teleology, moving toward fulfillment. That is the form that it takes. So we have the faithfulness of God through the faithful obedience of Christ as the content of justification. The form of justification is eschatological. It's the eschatological movement of kingdom, and therefore fulfillment is the moving forward of the Torah law for Paul as a moving forward unto the Father's all along intended purpose. So we end up with those 6 key aspects of covenant theology for Paul. He writes a covenant theology, says N.T. Wright. That is what he writes. In Galatians and in Romans and in Ephesians, Paul is writing a covenant theology for a new covenant people, framed within an eschaton of a new Exodus. It gives us a great teaching here, but we will have a recall triad in order to encapsulate the entire lesson next.